To be looking at some of the pressures imposed on working relationships under COVID-19 and take a quick canter through how to manage some of those conflicts and issues that may arise, and in particular the role that workplace mediation can play. So just going to have a quick look at some of the causes of conflict. Obviously, potential for conflict everywhere. Wherever humans interact with each other, there's going to be potential for conflict, especially where there's anxiety or tension and competing interests. I've listed some of the sort of old favourites and some of the new tensions and anxieties that we're all suffering as a result of COVID-19. I've put work at the top of the list, but only because it's our #1 interest today. But things like finances, there are going to be people living on 80% of their income if they've been furloughed, or they may have lost more. There may be possible loss of commissions, which could, for some workers, be the bulk of their remuneration package. Then there are issues like health, not just our own, but other people's, especially our nearest and dearest. And of course, the interests of keeping ourselves healthy and doing our jobs may well be in conflict. And health doesn't just mean COVID-related health either. There's our mental health to take into account, as well as other underlying conditions that we may already be suffering with. And we may be concerned about our immediate family, not just their health, but homeschooling them, or even just the difficulties of being locked in 24/7 with your feral children and your stir-crazy partner. I've recently been living in a house with 8 of us from 4 generations, plus 3 dogs, as well as some of them being key workers, a police officer, a school teacher, and a vulnerable adult with underlying conditions. All of those are apt to cause real tensions and real causes for potential conflict. You may also be looking after your elderly and infirm relatives, and isolation and lockdown requirements may be stopping you from doing that, may be causing you enormous concerns. And then your social relationships, both with work colleagues and your wider social circle, will have been impacted by all of this. And your hobbies and your pastimes, they're going to have been interrupted. And whoever thought food shopping was going to be a major source of anxiety and tension? Generally, it's not thought to be a good idea to bring issues in your private life to work, or your work issues home. But COVID-19 has certainly thrown all of that in a liquidizer together with a great big host of other unexpected stresses and anxieties and switched it on to maximum. The sudden and unexpected move to having to put a whole load of your workers onto a remote working regime will have caused all kinds of issues, and will still be causing all kinds of issues. There are issues about monitoring productivity, monitoring quality, issues thrown up by data protection, health and safety issues and risk assessments for working at home. How do you manage people when they're working from home? How do you do it effectively? How do you make sure they have the right resources? Is home working practical for them? Are they surrounded by children who they are also trying to homeschool at the same time? There may be communication issues. Are you all using the same channels of communication, or is there a weird hodgepodge of WhatsApp messages, WhatsApp groups, emails, Zoom meetings and so on? How do you make your communications consistent? And then there's all sorts of scope for discrimination between workers who may not have access to the same sorts of resources and so on. Maybe issues about fairness of allocation of work and the scope for earning commission for people whose work is based mostly on commission. That, of course, can easily be a very great source of conflict, as well as issues around whether or not you can actually have people remote working at all, whether you should be making them redundant, whether they should be furloughed, or indeed whether they should be dismissed. And then there are a whole raft of new challenges in relation to people who are still required to go to work, or who may be required to go work elsewhere because they're heating engineers or drivers and so on. People who are still having to go out to work because of the nature of the work they do are also producing brand new areas for potential conflict. Concerns over access to PPE, concerns over social distancing. Only yesterday I had a call from an employer who's got a problem because they need a worker to start returning to work and stop working remotely, but the worker doesn't want to return on safety grounds. Is there a risk that if they dismiss that worker, if they refuse to come back to work, they will automatically unfairly dismiss them because they have reasonable concerns about safety issues? And then there are also issues around working on site with reduced numbers of workers. Is that safe? Is it safe for someone to do something on their own, or with more limited numbers of people doing that work? Is there potentially a risk of injury? Is there a risk of overloading them with work? Or is there indeed a risk of them being exploited or taken advantage of in some other way? Are there perhaps security threats from having reduced numbers of workers on the site? and then issues about allocation, distribution of resources, changes to working practices, where you may be requiring your workers to work different shifts and so on, or to engage in other working practices in order to maintain social distancing. All of those things can lead to conflict. What about the absence of direct close supervision and oversight, where, for instance, you might have somebody who is looking after a power station and the management have been moved off-site and are now managing remotely? Are there issues that might cause? So how do you go about managing conflict remotely? Lockdown and remote working has certainly imposed some new limitations on how you can deal with workplace conflict. Everything now needs to be done remotely. And what's in the company toolkit for managing conflict? Traditionally, where an employee has a problem, they raise a grievance. Where an employer has a problem, they use some sort of process, whether that be disciplinary or capability performance, sickness management and so on. Or are you already sufficiently up to speed and using things like facilitation and mediation to try to resolve your issues? In this new normal, how do you manage conflict or behaviour remotely? And does it matter what sort of conflict you're dealing with? Are you going to have to use different tools if it's a manager and a subordinate who are in conflict, as opposed to peer-to-peer conflicts, or conflicts within a team or department or branch or region even? What about if it involves external parties? How are you going to manage that conflict effectively if you can't pull people into meetings to speak to them? So in a sort of parody of snog, marry, avoid, we often describe the main approaches of managers as fudge, tackle or avoid. The fudgers come up with some sort of short-term stopgap solution that either sweeps the real problem under the carpet or provides only temporary or partial relief, but risks recurrence and festering in the meantime. Tacklers do at least like to address the problem head on and try to resolve it straight away. And the avoiders don't address it at all and hope it will sort itself out in some sort of magical way. It's amazing how few businesses really devote resources to training managers in how to communicate effectively, how to manage people well, and most of all, how to have difficult conversations with the people they manage. Most managers could really do with some difficult conversations training, or some basic conflict management skills or coaching skills, facilitation or mediation skills, and not just rely upon referring to HR, or as we like to call it, phone a friend. So a very quick example from real life. I've changed the names in order to protect the innocent, but we'll call them Emma and Gary. Emma works for Gary. Since lockdown, Emma's been working remotely from home. Lockdown's been very complicated for her. She's a divorced single parent with 3 children under the age of 10. Her ex-husband, with whom she's been sharing childcare quite effectively, lives in a shared house himself with a number of other people. Lockdown has therefore given rise to a host of issues for them. Emma was unhappy about the kids spending time at her ex-husband's house because of the risks posed by moving between households, and the fact that her ex-husband's household is already a mix of separate households. So she and her ex-husband came up with a plan. He'd move back in with Emma during lockdown and they would share the parenting in one house. They would allow time for each of them to carry on working and to share some homeschooling responsibilities. And it all worked very well for the first 4 weeks of lockdown. Then ex-hubby got a little bit stir-crazy and decided to go to a friend's house, where he also met up with some more buddies and they had a bit of a party. He also plays in a band, and the band decided to have a day in the recording studio together. Emma was mortified when she found out, threw him out of the house and told him to go and self-isolate. Now, apart from all the stress that caused, she was now having to manage homeschooling and working and running the house all on her own. Enter her manager, Gary. Gary's got lots of pressures too, including an elderly mum with dementia in a care home for whom he's very concerned, is devoting energy to try to find ways to make her safe. He's also under pressure from a client to finalise a report that Emma has been working on and which she should have completed a few days ago. He sends an email to Emma that essentially says, "Where is the report? I need it on my desk today." The email contains no pleasantries nor inquiry as to how she's getting on. Emma was already feeling stressed about not completing the report and all the other things. She now opens the email a couple of minutes after breaking up a fight between the 3 children over the last 2 slices of bread in the house and relieving the 4-year-old of a jar of chocolate spread from which she was taking large dollops of chocolate with her fingers. She's already feeling angry and defensive before Gary follows up his email with a phone call from which he also omits any pleasantries and only asks about the report. There are then many unpleasantries exchanged during the course of quite a short and rather shouty phone call. Gary wants to sack Emma for failing to get work done on time. Emma wants to resign and claim unfair dismissal, or at least raise a grievance because she feels she's being bullied. Enter the workplace mediator with my white hat on, but it could have been someone else within the business with some basic mediation or facilitation skills. A mutual friend, in fact, put us in touch with Gary. Within about 5 minutes of talking to Emma and Gary separately, it became very clear that this whole situation could and should have been avoided if they'd begun their conversation just by asking each other how they were, and having the sort of working relationship where they could actually tell each other, at least in outline, what their current challenges were. On the very same day that the issue was brought to me, I had separate Zoom conversations with Gary and Emma, got a handle on the background, and then brought them together in a virtual joint meeting. It lasted less than 40 minutes and resulted in much apologising and resolving to communicate better with each other going forwards, which was, on any view, a massive win-win scenario. So that's just one recent example of just how quick and effective workplace mediation can be, and also a demonstration of how it can be done remotely. It's not dependent on being able to pull people together in a neutral venue and have them speaking to one another across a table. Platforms such as Zoom have been amazingly effective for workplace mediation, not least because of its facility for breakout rooms and so on. I just wish that I'd bought shares in it before all of this started. It's also very effective for providing training for managers in acquiring the sort of soft skills that need to be acquired in having difficult conversations or managing conflict. You can use it for one-to-one role plays as part of a bigger training session. So there are effective means out there for dealing with conflict remotely, and I hope that I've just given you a very quick canter through some of the key pointers. So if you're interested in finding out more, just having a chat about some current problem that you've got on your plate, do feel free to give me a call. Otherwise, as my ex-girlfriend once said to me, I'm done talking, I'm leaving you now.